Hey Waptors, Mr. Lassiter with you, and we're going to be looking at land empires in the age of imperialism up to 1870, specifically the Ottomans and the Russian Empire, as we went over China earlier today in class. So let's go ahead and get started with the Ottoman Empire, and we're going to start in Egypt and look at some reforms that come about there as a result or following the invasion of Napoleon. So Napoleon invades in 1798. He defeats Mamluk forces there, and 15 months later he is forced to kind of return to France, where of course he seizes power and makes himself emperor and then tries to take over all of Europe. But his generals had little hope of holding on to power, and in 1801 they agree to withdraw. Muhammad Ali then emerges as the victor in an ensuing power struggle, and he begins to use many French practices in order to build up a new Egyptian state. So basically a French-influenced modernization program, which included the establishment of schools to train modern military officers and factories to supply his new army. These programs are going to be continued by his successors, including his son, who even invaded Syria and tries to start similar reforms there. But they ultimately are thwarted by European powers who push them out of Syria and back to more of the modern-day borders of Egypt and Israel. Muhammad Ali will remain in power until 1849 and his family all the way until 1952. But this kind of independence of Egypt and these reform movements, they're going to have an impact on the Ottomans here in a little bit, as we'll see. So reforms at the end of the 18th century in the Ottoman Empire had caused a lot of tension between the Sultanate and the Janissaries, but also noblemen and religious leaders. Sultan Selim III had introduced reforms in order to strengthen the military and central government and basically to standardize taxation. But you don't mess with a man's taxes, do you? So this tension actually resulted in revolts, including revolts of the Janissaries in Serbia in 1805. Selim suspends his reform program in 1806, but it was really too late to prevent a massive military uprising in Istanbul, which results in Selim, the Sultan, being captured and executed before forces could take back the capital. In Greece, we see an independence movement that ends in 1829, in which Britain, France, and Russia assist the Greeks in their struggle for independence. Basically, they saw Greek independence as a kind of a victory or a triumph for European civilization over Middle Eastern or Eastern civilization. The loss of Greece is seen by the Sultan Mahmud II to be a great indicator of the weakness of the Ottoman military and financial organizations. So he uses the popular outrage over the loss of Greece to justify a series of reforms that included the creation of new army corps, the elimination of the Janissaries, and a reduction of the political power of the religious elite. Basically, the Greek insurrection, European intervention, and Egyptian attacks are all going to combine to drive this westernizing reform effort. The most comprehensive reform initiative was something called the Tanzimat program, or the restructuring program, initiated by Mahmud's successor, Abdul Majid, in 1839. And so it intended to move civil law away from control of religious elites and make the military and bureaucracy much more efficient in the Ottoman Empire. Under this Tanzimat reform, military, educational, social, economic, and political reform is undertaken. For example, there's reform in the way people dress. There's reform in the subjects that are taught in schools. There becomes equal access to courts for all male subjects and equal taxes across the board. But this reform is mostly limited to men, and we actually see the influence of women decrease in this time period. This leads us to another pretty significant event in the Ottoman Empire, that is separate from reform, I guess, the Crimean War. And the Crimean War was fought in the region, of course, of Crimea, and it's caused by Russians' expansion southward into what had been Ottoman territory. And so, in response, Britain, France, and the Ottomans form an alliance in order to block Russian expansion. And they succeed. They defeat the Russians and stop their expansion into not just the Middle East, but also into Eastern Europe. The Crimean War, though, brings significant changes. For example, the Russian government, as we'll see in a little bit, is forced to reform. Britain and France carry out extensive propaganda campaigns to emphasize their roles in the war. And the French press even promotes a sense of unity between Turks and French society. But the longest lasting of the effects of the Crimean War really are that it marks a transition into modern warfare. And then also, secondarily, the Ottoman Empire comes into greater involvement with European commerce. And this is going to relate to some more reforms. But speaking first about modern warfare, we see the development of modern military technology. For example, percussion caps and certain rifles that are used in the Crimean War were the beginning of a series of subsequent changes in military technology that basically results in the invention of the machine gun. Railways begin to be used in warfare in transferring weapons and men, and we see the beginning of trench warfare in this time period. After the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire continues to establish Western reform by establishing secular financial and commercial institutions based on the European model. These reforms contribute to a shift of population from rural to urban areas and the development of professional and wage labor classes. But they don't necessarily solve the regime's fiscal problems. The Ottoman state's dependence on foreign loans is seen as a drawback. They develop a trade deficit and inflation. And so this decline in the power of the Ottomans and decline in their wealth inspires a group of educated urban men known as the Young Ottomans to band together and work for constitutionalism. A constitution is ultimately granted in 1876, but a coup soon places a more conservative ruler on the throne. And so the Ottoman Empire thus continues its weakened existence basically with the help of European powers all the way until 1922 following World War I. All right, so next thing we're going to look at is the Russian Empire. And we'll start out with Russia and Europe. In 1700, only 3% of the Russian population lived in cities, and Russia was fairly slow to acquire modern infrastructure and modern forms of transportation. However, Alexander I, who you see pictured here, aspired to Western-style economic development, and he's going to undertake top-down westernizing reforms. However, Russians oftentimes feared this westernization, and under Nicholas I, Alexander I's son, Russians begin to be suspicious of these ideas, and it basically stalls reform and slows down development. So, for example, some fears of the West, Slavophiles, people who kind of like the Eastern identity of Russia, opposed Westerners. They thought it would bring kind of a despot to the throne. And they embraced this idea of pan-Slavism following the Crimean War. And because of their kind of not caring for the West so much, the West in turn started to not trust Russia. And so we call this Russophobia. So it's almost like they wanted to be friends, but they don't quite, can't quite get along. They don't trust each other enough. With Asia, Russian expansion at the end or in the 19th century caused friction between Russia and China and Russia and Japan, Russia and Iran, and of course the Ottoman Empire. Remember that by 1800, if you follow my mouse, Russia had basically expanded all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But as they tried to add lands to the south and to the southeast, they were met with opposition. For example, Britain took steps to halt Russian expansion before they could gain control of all of Central Asia. Of course, harming the Ottomans and British influences in the area. Ultimately, though, Russia has cultural contact with Europe from the late 17th century on. The reforms of Alexander I promised more on paper, though, than they delivered in practice. And since opposition to reform came from wealthy families who feared reform would bring out despotism, these reforms were slowed down. Their fears were though, realized during the reign of Nicholas I. So, in response to this, to Nicholas I first coming to power and the slowing of reform, Russians who wanted to reform begin to kind of become, oh gosh, losing my words here, become unhappy. There's a good word to use. Anyways, in 1825, a revolt known as the Decembrist Revolt is carried out by a group of reform-minded military officers after the death of Alexander I. And they wanted to push reform one more time, but ultimately this defeat is going to mean that there was going to be almost zero reform during the reign of Nicholas I for the next 3 decades about. Following the Crimean War in the 1850s and heavy penalties which are imposed on Russia, a new czar comes to power, Alexander II. And because of this humiliation and the problems facing Russia, he institutes major reforms. Under Alexander II, reforms and cultural trends that were begun under his grandfather Alexander I are encouraged and expanded. So, for example, the 19th century in Russia sees numerous Russian scholarly and scientific achievements, as well as the emergence of some of the most significant writers in history, specifically Russian writers and thinkers. So that's it. That basically walks you through what we did not cover in class today. Take a look at the chronology that you see here and make sure that you can kind of peg what happens in all of these major events in the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and the Qing Empire in China. Keep in mind that the role that reform played in this, and also the roles that Western European influence play in this, in all 3 of these empires during this imperial time period. That's all, guys. Have a wonderful evening.